Welcome everyone to our Packers News Training Camp Chat, virtually alongside Pete Dougherty. I am Olivia Reiner. The Packers are just 4 days away from their first on-field practices of training camp. We'll get a glimpse soon into what some of the team's personnel decisions are going to look like as competition ramps up, including a look at the defensive backs. We will discuss that group today. Before we get into that, I want to remind you, as always, you can be a part of our conversation, whether you're on YouTube, Facebook, or Periscope. Leave a comment or a question in the chat. We will get to some of those today. We love to hear from you. It's always good to hear from you. Pete, I want to start by talking about the departure of cornerback Tramon Williams. Because that he's no longer on the team, he is still a free agent, the Packers have a hole there at nickel corner. Williams played over 70% of the defensive snaps in 2019. Although he was referred to as the third corner, being that slot corner, for all intents and purposes, he was a starter on this team. Now, general manager Brian Gutekunst said yesterday that the third cornerback could potentially be Chandon Sullivan, sort of hinting at that. How likely is it that Sullivan is the starter at nickel corner?
I would say odds on it's probably going to be him, I would think. I really think that unless Josh Jackson just comes out and is playing great, that the next option, if they're at all concerned about how Sullivan's playing, is moving Savage to the slot corner and replacing him at safety with, Will Redmond or, whoever they would decide to be the guy there. So that would be, he's got the physique. He's a really good athlete for the coverage in there, and plus he's a good tackler. And, the nickel corner is a linebacker position, really, so you're involved in the run game. But I would think Sullivan would be the odds-on favorite. And, he played pretty decent football last year when called upon when injuries hit.
Mm-hmm. Let's look out sort of at the top two that we know for sure are going to be important parts of the Packers secondary there, and Jaire Alexander and Kevin King. They managed to stay healthy throughout 2019, combining to play for 31 games. They made 7 interceptions, had 32 pass breakups. What do they have to continue to show in 2020 to prove that they are an elite pairing?
With King, it's the big part is just staying healthy, because his first 2 years he was injured more than he played. With Alexander, it's just, he's a young guy still. It's just keep getting better and not having, he's had a couple games where, bad games. He had one against Dallas last year, where he just had a really tough time against the Cowboys. He got beat a lot in that game. And I know there was another game later in the year where he did too. So I think it's more just getting a little, not getting caught peeking in the backfield, at the quarterback, and not giving up the occasional big play. But he's a really talented ascending guy, and still wouldn't be surprised if he ends up being a Pro Bowl cornerback in the next couple of years. He's really talented and highly, highly competitive. That's one of his great strengths is, and you can see that on the practice field, the way he battles and trying to rip the ball out of guys' hands, even after the catch, even after they're basically out of bounds. He's still in there, fighting for his life, trying to rip the ball out of there. So that competitiveness is a really important quality at that position, and confidence too, and no shortage of that with him.
A lot left out there for Kevin King and Jaire Alexander in 2020. Moving into the second level of the Packers defense, specifically in the middle of the field, that hybrid safety linebacker position is a position that defensive coordinator Mike Pettine really likes to use a defensive back specifically in. Last season, it was safety Raven Green that seemed to be the Packers' top choice. However, he did sustain an injury in week 2 that, for the most part, kept him out of the season entirely. He was available to play in the NFC Championship game against the San Francisco 49ers. However, he never played in that game. Since departed now, Ibrahim Campbell was who ended up filling in at that position for Green. Now that Green is presumably healthy, how likely is it that Pettine continues to use a Green or another defensive back in that particular role?
First of all, please forgive Winston. I think there's a squirrel in the backyard, right? Um, Green is their favorite guy there, and actually was off to a really good start last season. Before I think it was the second game he got hurt right in the first half. So, but he was off to he had a good camp and played well the first game and a third or whatever it was before he got hurt. So yeah, he's the most likely guy. Judging from what Pettin said on his one Zoom conference this offseason, it sure sounds like he's not planning on playing any less dime than he did last season. And so that means that hybrid safety linebacker is going to be on the field a lot, and that's probably going to be Green. It sure sounds like Pettin's plan is to continue playing that. I mean, it is a passing league, so you got to stop the pass. But the Packers, either via scheme or personnel or somehow, obviously have to play the run better than last season, because you can't totally neglect it or it'll get you blown off the field like it did in the NFC Championship game against San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Something to certainly keep an eye on heading into training camp. Practices start on Saturday. Very exciting, Pete. Let's move on to some of the questions here from our lovely viewers. We'll start with this question from Mark related to training camp starting and the Packers being back in town in Green Bay. Mark asks, where are players staying since dorms are not being used? Typically, in the past, the Packers would stay at St. Norbert's College for at least the beginning of training camp to start working out there, training there, and then eventually, once they got into the preseason, getting to go out and sort of live where they typically would during the regular season. Now, Pete, it seems like for the most part, players are staying at their homes if they have homes or places in Green Bay. If not, they're being put up in hotels. However, it does not seem that the Packers at the moment are considering creating their own artificial bubble that we know of at the moment.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think they stay at St. Norbert. I think it's for the first 3 weeks of camp. I think maybe through the first preseason game, and then they let guys go. As far as I know, from what I've heard, I mean, players, the ones who have houses and apartments up here, they're staying there. And the ones who aren't, there's a local hotel pretty close to the stadium where they put those guys up.
Mm-hmm. So that seems to be what the situation is now. We'll see if it changes. It sounds like certain teams are doing their own sort of bubble situation. It looks like the Cowboys might be doing something. Same with the Saints, keeping all the players in a hotel. However, as far as we know now, the players are in their own places if they have places to stay. Let's move on to our Periscope question here. Big news that we didn't address on yesterday's live stream because the news broke as we were going live or as we were ending the live stream was that the Packers signed a new wide receiver in Fulham out. I believe that's how you pronounce his last name. Was previously with the Detroit Lions. We've got a question here that asks if he's a viable option on special teams. What are the Packers expecting from someone who's sort of a waiver pickup at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, you make a claim on a guy like that at this point. Odds are against him making the team. Maybe they see him as a really good practice squad guy because you think teams are going to have to tap deep into that expanded 16-man practice squad with the likelihood there's teams are going to get hit by the coronavirus at some point, maybe sooner rather than later. So maybe they see him as a good fit because he's the same body type as all those other guys. Big, athletic, not all that fast for the position. It's the same kind of guy. Every once in a while you make a claim like this and you get really lucky and the guy plays really well for you. But most of them are just, towards the bottom of the roster guys, and maybe he makes the team, maybe he makes the practice squad. You wouldn't think this is a guy who's going to change their outlook for the season or be an upgrade, over the guys they already have, at least the top 4 or 5. But that'll be proven on the football field and on the practice field.
The Packers certainly seem to have a type at wide receiver, especially someone that can block and has good run blocking capabilities. And it would appear that this pickup is sort of in line with their thinking when it comes to the approach at wide receiver, whether or not he pans out and has any real impact on this team remains to be seen. We'll find out soon enough. However, always interesting to see where their heads are at when they're looking for talent, picking up off the waivers there. So thank you for your question. Let's move on to Kenny here. Talk a little bit about some offense. Why not? We've talked a lot about the defense so far on this stream. Kenny asks, how much will running back AJ Dillon be used this year? Running backs room seems a little bit crowded, with the top two clearly being in Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams, both of which are entering in their contract years. However, besides AJ Dillon, who was the Packers' second-round draft pick, there's also players that are worth keeping an eye on, in someone even like Dexter Williams, who was the Packers' sixth-round draft pick back in 2019, and Tyler Ervin even, who the Packers picked up late in the season last year, mostly as their return specialist. However, he did get a couple offensive snaps and was used in a couple of interesting ways in the Packers offense. Where does AJ Dillon fit in that room right now heading into 2020?
Not having the off season. It's funny I was talking with our boss Stu Courtney about this. We were talking about this earlier today. Not having the off season and all that will hurt a little bit for getting him playing time, at least early. But they used a second round pick on him. That's a really high pick. You looked at the numbers. You looked at Rodgers' passing numbers when Aaron Jones was on the field and when he wasn't, which in part is about Jones's receiving abilities, but it's probably a lot more about just the run threat that he presented. And Jones played 60% of the snaps, and Rodgers' QBR, the ESPN rating, which is 0 to 100 scale, was like 78, which would have ranked 6th or 7th in the league overall. And when Jones wasn't on the field, I think it was 28, which would have been out of the bottom, which would have been lower than at least 32nd. So that's a huge difference. So I think that's one of the big reasons why they drafted this guy. One, to protect themselves in case they decide they can't afford to re-sign Jones next year, but also to have another really, really good running threat, an equal running threat to Jones out there for 95% of the play. So, the first half of the season, I would, maybe they work him in slowly and it's not all that much, but I would guess in the second half of the season, he's going to be out there a fair amount. Now, if Jones stays healthy and plays 60%, I'm not saying Dillon's going to get the other 40%, but by the end of the season, maybe, a third of those, a third of the snaps, something like that. That's my best guess. It depends on how he picks things up and how he performs and if he's healthy. But that would be my best guess, is kind of slowly working into a, fairly significant role by, later November, maybe.
A lot of this contingent on how he picks up things going into this season, how quickly he picks up the offense, and of course, where everybody else is around him. If Aaron Jones is healthy, if Jamal Williams is healthy, we'll see where AJ Dillon is able to take some touches in this Packers running backs room. Let's move on here. This question from Periscope. They want to know, who's the third wide receiver on this team? Is it going to be Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Jake Kumaro, or Equanimeous St. Brown? Head coach Matt LaFleur has shied away from using wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 in his offense. That being said, how important is it for them to have someone emerge as that third player behind Devontae Adams, Allen Lazard? Who is that? Who's that going to be?
Yeah, they could use that second player even. I would, that'd be as big a concern. I mean, obviously Lazard, the implication there is Lazard is going to be the number 2, and that's probably your best bet. There's a possibility it just won't be very defined, and it'll be week to week, and some weeks some guys will play more than others, or they'll all play somewhere in the vicinity of the same amount of snaps. If I had to just absolutely guess, I think I might go with St. Brown. When it's all said and done, maybe gets the most snaps of those 3, and then maybe Valdes-Scantling. But St. Brown had actually surpassed Valdes-Scantling in the playing rotation at the end of their rookie seasons, but then he broke his leg at the end of training, or near the end of training camp last year, and missed last year. So Valdes-Scantling, became the number 3, but he played his way out of the rotation by the end of the year. He was hardly getting on the field at all. So it's really up in the air. MVS is the most talented of the 3, and Kumaro probably has the best trust of the quarterback of the three. So, we're all just, your guess is as good as mine. Like I said, if I had to guess, I think I might go with St. Brown as the one who would end up at season's end with the most snaps out of those three guys you list there.
St. Brown still with a lot to prove after missing an entire season last year. I'm sure he's hopeful that he can make an impact on this offense. The opportunity is there for any of these receivers to do so. So thank you for your question. Let's move on to Steve. Going back into the running backs room, Steve asks, is Dexter Williams the odd man out in the running backs room? And it's a good question because last season, when it came to Dexter Williams, Matt LaFleur said there's no such thing as a redshirt season. And for all intents and purposes, Dexter Williams did take a redshirt season last year. We didn't get to see him very often in games. And when he was in games, it was usually sort of, not very significant minutes there for him. What does he need to show in this very short window of on-field training camp practices in order to make a name for himself and potentially earn a spot on the team this season?
I think the main thing he needs to show is that he knows what he's doing on every play, and if there's any checks or anything, that he knows what he's doing. I don't know if you remember this, but it was in camp fairly early in training camp last year. I think it was fairly early. And they were switching from one drill to the next, and he was the first guy out there for the first play. So, they obviously tell everybody everybody knows what the play is going to be. And he blew his assignment on the first play. And LaFleur generally isn't real vocal as far as chewing guys in practice, but he just jumped him and basically said, how could you not know what you're doing on the first play of this new period? And that, I think, was indicative of Williams just not being as mindful of the details of the playbook as he needed to be. So the big thing for him, I think, this offseason would have been, and through camp, will be to show that he's got a really good feel for the offense now, that he knows what to do, and that they can rely on him to do what he's supposed to do every snap that he's on the field. Because he's got the running ability. He's a big, fast guy.
Yeah, we'll see if he is able to prove himself beyond some of those other names in that running backs room. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of people there. So let's move we'll take David's question here about the Packers backfield. He asks if it's uniquely interesting and its potential for versatility. What do you have to make sort of about what their skill sets are in the Packers backfield in particular?
Yeah, in this offense, you got to play, it's this way pretty much around the league, but especially in this offense, you got to be able to catch the ball. And if you can function well in the passing game, assignments also, knowing all that stuff and picking up protection, it just helps an offense so much. The Patriots showed that, in the Super Bowl a couple of years ago, with their running backs and all the catches that the guy from Wisconsin had winning the Super Bowl that was 2 Super Bowls ago. Aaron Jones showed that last year. Remember how they started splitting them out, and for a couple of games they were just eating people up because they were always with a linebacker out to cover them, and it forced defenses to change and actually cover them on a quarterback when they split him wide out, which then helps the offense in other ways. So if you're versatile, it helps the offense immensely. It helps the play caller and the quarterback a lot. So I think that's what they're looking for. And what was interesting with Dillon was, I can't remember the number of catches. Maybe you remember the number he had last year at Boston College, but it wasn't many. And that's not a part of their offense. They never threw him the ball. But the Packers thought that he could be a really good catching the ball in the backfield because he had a good combine workout where he caught everything and not just catching the ball, but they thought he looked natural catching the ball, like he wasn't fighting it at all. And I guess we'll find out, in camp starting next week, whether he can do it. But having that versatility is a huge part of it just adds so much to an offense because defenses, when they can't be sure where the guy's going to line up, it just makes things a lot tougher on the coordinator and on the defense.
Pete, we had that question earlier about who we think is going to be the third wide receiver. You even mentioned that I guess it's a question even who's the second wide receiver if Allen Lazard can really prove to be that consistent player heading into his second year in the Packers offense. That being said, what about Aaron Jones? Aaron Jones is kind of the second receiver in a lot of ways. Just the way that he played last season. Granted, I think in the first half of the season he was catching more passes and just getting more looks. He was being used more as a receiver in the offense the first half of the season compared to the second half of the season. But with someone who has that threat, I think it's a possibility that he could continue to increase that workload heading into 2020 as another receiver.
Yeah, I'm not saying he's Christian McCaffrey. I'm not sure how many catches McCaffrey had last year, but I would guess it was over 90, I would think. I'm not saying he'll do that because, for one thing, he doesn't play as many snaps. But would it be a shocker if he ends up being the third or fourth leading receiver on the team? He may not play quite enough snaps to do that, but he could end up having a lot of catches. You got the tight ends, too, if Sternberger or Tanyan breaks out, one or both of those guys could absorb a lot of those catches that would normally go to receivers, and they're probably going to play a lot of two tight end looks this year. So it could be that Devontae Adams has about 125, and then there's a bunch of guys between 30 and 50. It could end up being that way.
Good questions heading into this upcoming season, and this kind of relates to what you were just talking about here, Pete. Tripp wants to know, is tight end Jay Sternberger the assumed starter at tight end? Sternberger missed various portions of the season last year. He injured himself in training camp and missed the beginning of the season. With someone who didn't necessarily have a lot of time to show what he can do in this offense, how likely is it that he is able to show out in his second year with the Packers this upcoming season?
What he did as a blocker bodes well, because that was not at all on his resume coming out of college. I mean, he was strictly a receiving guy, not that he was out there just blowing guys off the ball or anything, but he showed a real willingness to block, which is the starting point for, a tight end, at least if you're really willing to stick your nose in there. So that bodes well. And the way he played at the very end of the season, the touchdown catch at San Francisco. That's a good question, and I'm really not sure. I wouldn't want to have to make a bet on whether it's him or Tanyan as the starter. I guess if you just really made me pick, I'd probably lean towards Sternberger, if not at the start of the year, by the end of the year. But Tanyan's got some talent too, and looked pretty good at some moments, like that catch against Dallas, on which he also hurt himself and basically wrecked his season. It could be either one of those guys. But I guess if I had to bet, by November, I'm thinking Sternberger. That'd be my best guess.
Robert Tanyan, also somebody who missed a portion of last season due to injury. I believe he sustained an injury week 5 around there in Dallas. He had surgery this offseason to repair a core muscle surgery. So again, another player that still has some things left to prove heading into this upcoming season as well. Let's move on here to Jason. This is a question that I think we'll probably get into more detail about 2021 free agents and the cap tomorrow. I'll be live with Tom Silverstein around 4:30 Central to discuss the cap a little bit more, talk about some of the responsibilities that the Packers have with their free agents in 2021. So if you're interested in that, we'll get into a little bit more of that tomorrow as well. But I wanted to take this today. Pete, we can chat a little bit about this. Do we feel that the Packers signing Aaron Jones to an extension is one of the top priorities heading into the 2020 season, or following the 2020 season, or even, they could decide to extend him now too. The Packers have a lot to juggle in 2021 with their free agents. They have not only Aaron Jones, but also left tackle David Bakhtiari, defensive tackle Kenny Clark, cornerback Kevin King, center Corey Linsley, just to name a few. They have a lot of responsibilities heading into 2021 in terms of who they want to bring back and who they don't. Not to mention potentially a smaller cap in 2021, $175 million at the very least, not including any sort of rollover that the Packers would carry from 2020 into 2021. How big of a priority is Aaron Jones, of all those names on that list of free agents, how big of a priority is he heading into this next season?
I'd probably at this point, I'd put him third, which means it's kind of shaky or tough to say whether, three guys get re-signed, because you got to think Bakhtiari and Kenny Clark are the top two priorities. Those positions, left tackle and a really good defensive lineman who's also uncommonly young for a guy who's finishing his rookie contract. They're so hard to find. I'll be shocked if they don't re-sign both of those guys. And as you said, the cap going down next year does not help them at all. It was going to be tough anyway, and it's going to make it even tougher with a lower cap now. And the thing is, Jones is such a good player, and basically, besides the quarterback, he was the guy who made their offense go last year. So, I'm sure they want to keep him, but recent history has shown that paying running backs big is really risky, and you can end up blowing a lot of money if they get hurt and they age quickly and all that stuff. And Jones does have an injury history. Maybe they can get him cheap enough. They offer just enough guaranteed money. He knows his own injury history. Maybe that's enough to just make him say, I'll take the bird in the hand. Like if they approached him later this season, I'll take the bird in the hand and take, X amount of guaranteed millions of dollars rather than take my chances in free agency because I might get hurt before then. So maybe they can work out a deal that they feel is, something they can handle. But it's going to be that'll be a tough one. I'll be interested to know what Tom thinks too, because Corey Linsley's a really good player, and center's an important position, but you can't have everything in this league, and especially with the way things are going, with the cap next year, you really can't have everything. I guess who knows? Maybe because the cap's going down for everybody, maybe that depresses salaries for all these guys. So maybe they can get something done with 3 or 4 of them. And then you have King too, whose injury history will really be working against him. A lot of hard choices there for Brian Gutekunst and Russ Ball.
A lot of hard choices. However, General Manager Brian Gutekunst acknowledged recently when he was speaking with the media that the playing field is level for everyone. Everyone's going to be dealing with these restraints in 2021. So as you said, Pete, perhaps there is a way to make things work with Aaron Jones and maybe some of those other lower priority free agents in 2021. That is going to do it for us today, everyone. As I mentioned, I will be back here with Tom Silverstein tomorrow around 4:30 Central to have another conversation, this time geared more on the salary cap. However, if you have other questions, we're happy to take them and discuss whatever you guys want to talk about. Make sure you're subscribed to PackersNews.com for all of your Packers news. Follow us on all of our social media platforms. We'll have lots more updates, more live streams going forward as the Packers begin training camp officially, on-field practices of training camp on Saturday. For Pete, I'm Olivia. Have a good one. We'll see you next time.